Hello, welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging our Weirdi people of Wangang and Jangalingo country, the traditional owners of the land on which I am today, and offer my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge those whose ongoing efforts to promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures will leave a lasting legacy for future elders and leaders. And I extend that acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land from wherever you may be joining us today. Wadamuli. Today's webinar topic is exciting, E for exciting, ESG and carbon emissions profiling. I'd like to welcome our presenter, Bryce Hines from the Mead Perry Group. Bryce is coming to us from his caravan in true digital nomad and school holiday style. So thank you for giving us your time today, Bryce.
No problem.
For those of you who have watched our webinars before, you might have guessed I like to find some interesting information about our presenters. So I Googled you, Bryce, and I found the bio from an environmental charity that Bryce runs. So this is the ego boosting one that they've put on their page. So Bryce boasts 25 years experience at management and executive level of local government, from small councils to industry peak bodies to large metropolitan councils. It's sounding good so far, Bryce. His time in local government allowed Bryce to gain invaluable experience across a range of portfolios, including strategic planning, regulation and compliance, natural resource management, and waste and environmental management. So you're sounding pretty good so far. So I think we might you might know what you're talking about when you do the presentation. So.
Not sure about that.
So the presentation today is about reducing carbon emissions because it's re-emerged as a key driver for decision making, with councils now focusing on tracking and reducing our corporate emissions. And we also have so many councils who are at the very beginning of their journey. So today the webinar is going to outline the key factors contributing to these emissions, review assessment methodologies, discuss the necessary data. And we're also going to delve into the benefits of conducting a carbon emissions analysis and identify opportunities for effective reduction. Oh, my goodness, lots of big words. It's a heavy topic to come to from the beach. So the session's going to be in two parts. So we'll have plenty of opportunity for Q&A. So for everyone who's out there in webinar world, listening to us live, you can submit questions using the live Q&A button that you'll find on your screen. So please feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the webinar because we'll respond to them during our Q&A. So now I'm going to hand over to you, Bryce, and you can follow all of that.
Well, thank you, Zoe. I'm not sure who wrote that fiction you were reading out before, but anyway, take it where you get it. You can get it, I suspect. Yeah, look, welcome everybody this morning, and we'll make sure as best we can the topic isn't too heavy. As Zoe mentioned, I'm sitting in my caravan at the beach at the moment, and so not really, and do have my board shorts on, by the way, even though you can't see them. But so we'll try and keep it as light as we can as we move through this. I just wanted to highlight, apart from you get a bio like that when you've been in local government a long time, rather than being particularly good at anything during that period. But in terms of living and breathing, emissions reduction and ESG, as Zoe mentioned, one of my side hustles is running an environmental charity that the habitat and in fairness to local government, that's probably my one passion in life is growing trees. So I think I'll reword my biography just to say tree grower or something like that from now on, so folks like Zoe don't track it down on the internet. Look, from a finance perspective, as you all probably know, there's now been introduced an international standard around ESG, which is being rolled out as a reporting requirement under the accounting standards in some countries, and will also occur in Australia for large tier one companies in the next little while. It's probably the first time that a so-called environmental or triple bottom line activity has been captured in the accounting standards in some countries. So from a finance professional's perspective, this stuff will become much more front of mind, both in large companies, but also in those that buy goods from them or are a supplier to them. So I think it's important that that's understood. The other point that I'm very keen to make is, in my view, ESG is actually what local government is all about. So it's about local government is about governance. It's about serving the society that they represent, and it's about the environment of that area. So, in my view, ESG should be core business for local government and is core business for local government. This is about providing a reporting framework to ensure that councils can track how they're going with that and set targets and those kinds of things as far as that's concerned. So as I mentioned, and as Zoe mentioned, the webinar intends to cover the importance of ESG and how it can be embedded in council business. I'll also talk about how to undertake emissions profiles and the importance of those, particularly in terms of financial performance in local government, and have some really good examples where by taking a greater focus on emissions profiles, councils have not only managed to improve their environmental performance, but also managed to achieve some cost savings through that approach. So ESG 101, what is ESG? Well, ESG is environment, social and governance. And what that boils down to at the end of the day is the environmental side of things focuses on stewardship of the environment in areas that an organisation has the ability to influence. Of particular interest to local governments will be the areas of waste management, greenhouse gas emissions from activities, deforestation, which predominantly links to either agricultural practices or urban development, and the associated issues that come with that, and climate change and global warming. The social element concerns itself with how organisations treat people, including their employees and their customers. It includes policies around diversity and inclusion, how organisations engage with the community, how they achieve social equity in terms of what they're delivering. And as an example where an organisation may not well have met some of these requirements, you would have seen a fair degree of press around some mining companies in Western Australia and some culturally significant sites for First Nations on some of those mining sites. Not only was that an issue in terms of the operations of that organisation, but it's a key example of where it can be suggested that company hasn't met its obligations under ESG in terms of how it's engaged with the community. And the final element, which is governance, and this is really about how companies and organisations make their decisions. There is a strong push for large public entities to be more transparent around how they make those decisions. Diversity on their boards, and whilst there's plenty of publicity around gender diversity, it includes a whole range of diversity elements that should be included on boards, how they deal with corruption and their audit practices. The governance element of ESG is core business for local government. However, in the private sector, some of those elements are, I suppose, less of a priority for those organisations than perhaps they are in local government. ESG in the public sector is crucial because it aligns with those broader goals such as sustainability, community welfare and ethical governance. So, the public sector should have this as core business and should remain a core priority for any public sector entity. As we all know, local government is the level of government most close to the community, has a pivotal role in driving those sorts of ESG initiatives and achieving the sort of outcomes that are expected from communities, and particularly some of those more direct impacts that can be managed at the local level as far as the environment is concerned. Examples of successful ESG initiatives include things like sustainable urban planning, renewable energy, waste minimisation, community engagement programs, and some of the more higher level transparency initiatives. One that comes to mind for a council that I used to work at is some of the transparency initiatives that Ipswich City Council has rolled out in recent times. So how does this all boil out as far as the public sector is concerned, and particularly local government? In its simplest form, councils and local governments set policy. At the end of the day, that's one of the core functions of local government. So it's about establishing those policies and implementing those policies that promote sustainable practices. A really interesting example from Southeast Queensland in recent times is the large array of trials of 3-bin systems in waste management, as an example. So the whole green waste bin, or your garden waste bin, is an example of councils trialling and implementing new practices in their waste management area to drive more sustainable outcomes. At the end of the day, that stems from some data and science and experience that the removal of organic waste from your general waste stream not only provides feedstock for composting systems, but in addition to that, it reduces your impacts of your landfill through landfill gas emissions and those kinds of things. So, just as an example, in Southeast Queensland at the moment, there's the green waste third bin is a particularly highly relevant one at the moment. The second is around regulatory functions. So this is about ensuring that businesses comply with their environmental standards. So sediment and erosion control issues and those kinds of things, and the array of activities that council are involved in from an Environmental Protection Act perspective are examples of where policy and regulation, when well implemented by councils, can drive environmental outcomes as far as an ESG perspective. Community engagement, I'll put my hand on my heart and say that in my days in local government, I might have been one of those recalcitrant troglodytes that used to say community engagement just gets in the way of doing good things and getting the business done. But the reality is, in a democracy, it's important and critical that the community has an opportunity to engage in its leaders in the decision-making processes around that. It also enables, by engaging with the community, for the community to better understand the decisions that the public sector makes, and to enable them or facilitate for them to become more involved in those activities and promoting those sustainable practices. So I've certainly changed my understanding of community engagement. It's not about the old process of ticking the box from a government perspective. The true outcome of community engagement is having a community that's well informed and is motivated to engage in these sorts of environmental practices. As an environmental practitioner, there's nothing worse than thinking you've come up with the best idea in the world to improve the local environment if the community is not engaged in that. That stems to also for educational programs. Now, this is possibly again where I've changed my tune a little bit. Education practices tend to focus on those that are already incentivised, that are already engaged. So I see education as something that comes second to engagement. So once the community is engaged, is incentivised to get involved, it's at that point that they're most open to that education element, and that will be most effective. Suitable urban planning. We often consider urban planning not to have an ESG outcome, but the reality is urban planning is based around particularly the E and particularly the S. So good urban planning will drive good environmental outcomes, but it also drives engaged communities and societal development. I think most of us have seen some of the data from urban sprawl in the 80s and 90s, where communities weren't created through urban planning. It's only when you achieve that community level design in these activities that society becomes engaged with each other, genuine community is created, and societal outcomes are improved. I actually am firmly of the view that local government is at the epicenter, or the point of the spear, I suppose, as far as creating those communities are concerned. You know, the state government and the federal government can talk about housing supply and land supply and regional plans, but it's only when you get down to that community design element through good local urban planning that you get those strong social outcomes from urban planning. Here's core business for financial professionals around the place. The single greatest thing that I think councils can do as far as driving environmental outcomes outside of councils' immediate activities is actually in the procurement space. And I know this has been talked about for forever and a day. I've been in and around local government for 25 years, I think you said, Zoe. So, you know, procurement has also always been talked about in terms of outcomes that can be driven from procurement. I actually think ESG provides a really strong framework for councils, if implemented through procurement, to drive sustainable change from your suppliers. So, you know, you guys all have your weighting systems in your procurement activities, but to genuinely embed ESG into your procurement activities really will ensure that there is sustainable change. Now, that takes some thought. I've seen plenty of examples of folks looking to meet environmental outcomes through their procurement by you know, weighting things on 15 or 20% for environmental outcomes, or 15 or 20% for employing local jobs as key requirements as far as procurement is concerned. But I think a deeper dive into this, including for your larger supply contracts, to ask for ESG plans from your suppliers and assessing those plans against council strategic priorities, is a good way to drive change into the community. Business picks up on this stuff fairly quickly and engages with it. And I think particularly if council's in a position, and this may be a peak body activity, to provide councils who can then provide to their local businesses simple ESG frameworks and education, I think there's a real opportunity for council through procurement activities to drive change in this space. A really simple example, and I'll talk about it when we get into the emissions space, is a lot of the larger area councils in Western regions. The vast majority of their emissions are actually derived from diesel use in not only in council's fleet, but also in their subcontractor fleet. So to look to move towards, when it's available, things like biodiesel and those kinds of activities, by subcontractors will have a huge impact on emission profiles of those companies. So I'd also flag at this point, there's been significant media around the failure of some of the renewable energy constructors to engage with their communities effectively. ESG would provide them with a really strong mechanism to build their social license as far as their activities are concerned. And I also think there's an opportunity around that with councils to force their hand. It may seem counterintuitive, but the large mining enterprises have been excellent over the years in generating social license with local communities. I challenge you to name a community out west with a mine that doesn't have a community hall or a swimming pool that's at least partially paid for by a mining organisation within their local government area. Fundamentally, that's them engaging in the social element of ESG. So I think, coming back to the topic, there's a great benefit for councils to adopt ESG as a core element and drive that through procurement and through engagement with their large industries in their local area. And then the final element is really about monitoring and reporting. Now, you guys are finance professionals. You love a good report, love monitoring how we're tracking from a financial perspective. ESG performance should be tracked the same. It should be transparent and it should be accountable. Now, over the years, there's been every form of modelling and interpretive dance that you can imagine to monitor the more esoteric elements of this kind of stuff. The thing that's changed in recent times is that there's now an international standard of how you monitor ESG and report on that. So for the first time, there is a strong system in place internationally that would provide the tools for local government to effectively monitor their ESG policies and frameworks. So I'd encourage everybody to have a look at that international standard. But as I said, for the first time, it is quite quantified and a standardised process to monitor this stuff. And then the final element is reporting. Now, councils have got 1 million reports out there that some legally obliged, like annual reports and that sort of stuff. I don't suggest for 1 minute that you spin off a new report for the community for ESG, but the principles that are embedded in ESG processes can most certainly be embedded into your normal annual reporting process. It is an effective means of providing that reporting, as I said, particularly now that there's an international standard for ESG reporting. So here's just some examples around ESG initiatives that councils have implemented around the place, and ones that are publicly reported upon. So as an example, Brisbane City Council in the emissions space has done some extensive work around this, and particularly in their Clean Green Future City initiative. So as you can see, there's all elements there that are across the gambit of ESG initiatives. I will pull out of this one key one, and it surrounds the Green City initiative. I do a little bit of work for a whole range of councils, and one of the most simple means for council to improve social outcomes as well as environmental outcomes in a community is urban greening or street tree planting or whatever you'd like to call it. There's extensive data and science that says there's a direct correlation between social well-being, financial health at a household level, and urban greening, would you believe? So in areas, in suburbs and in urban areas that have a greater degree of urban greening, property prices are higher, social well-being is measured as higher. It helps with the urban heat island effect as far as some of the impacts of climate change is concerned. So I'd really draw your attention to urban greening as a simple, well understood mechanism whereby councils can drive not only environmental outcomes but social outcomes and economic outcomes as well. So Moreland Council, again, has a zero carbon policy. As you'll see there, again, just draw an example. Whilst it gets some weird publicity overseas around these 20-minute neighbourhoods, and, it's a secret way for evil society to control people or something, was some of the interesting media that I read. They've very much focused on the 20-minute neighbourhoods or the 15-minute neighbourhoods as a means of, through urban design, through those types of initiatives to drive social change. Again, there's a whole range of data that says that from a social wellbeing perspective, things like commute distance, connection to work, connection to community is critical to that social outcome, and at the same time delivers those environmental benefits. So just plucking those two out as examples where, whilst it might seem an environmental initiative, quite often these things are around that social element and the engagement of communities. Fremantle's another one. They've got a whole range of initiatives there, as you can see. Interestingly, they've pulled in elements such as culture and community, so cultural identity and those kinds of elements to empower communities, equity and local economy. So again, very much looking at that equity as far as transport is concerned, and social engagement, and they're tracking that as an example through sustainable transport. So you can see there on the slide, looking at things like your commute, your distance to commute, and those kinds of things as key elements, not just as the environmental outcome, again as that social and community engagement outcome. So that brings us to the end of part one as far as ESG is concerned. As I hope I've reinforced to you, I guess the things that have changed in recent times that are important, I think, to local government generally and financial professionals specifically, is that this stuff is now starting to be picked up in international standards. It is very much beyond environment to looking at those social outcomes, and the financial professional group has a key part to play in all of this, both generally and specifically, in particular in terms of providing that expertise as far as monitoring and tracking this stuff is concerned, as well as driving change through council policy, particularly, and around that procurement element, and how through that you might be able to drive change in your suppliers, in your community.
Thanks so much, Bryce. Wow, laying it out so simply for us to understand, like you said, ESG 101. Before we move on to the next part about emissions profiles, if anyone out there in webinar land has any questions, again, pop them in the live Q&A. This is your first opportunity. But I've got a few, because my brain's just been thinking as we're going through. I've spent a lot of time in rural and remote councils where, a lot of those examples require the transport network systems, the southeast corner, metropolitan councils, those sorts of things. And I mean, you specifically gave the example of the triple bin system, which I know there's been trials up and down the coastal cities as well. But I guess what options or innovative things have you seen for smaller councils where those sorts of initiatives are effectively cost prohibitive? It's a nice to do. Environmentally, it would be great, but financially, it's quite cost prohibitive. What sort of things have you seen other councils do to embrace ESG?
So one of the ones that immediately comes to mind, one of my favourite places in the world in Western Queensland, I spent a bit of time out there, is Longreach. Just as an example, and I don't know, some folks have been to Longreach. Longreach has got this wonderful walk along the main road between town and where the Qantas Museum and the airport is, and it's a botanical walk with examples of all the different regional ecosystems that you'll find in and around the Longreach area. I consider that an ESG initiative. It provides a range of outcomes for the community. So, as an example, it's an urban greening element. It's a management of heat island elements, but also, I'll lay my cards on the table. When I have been in Longreach, quite often I've stayed in the motels out towards the airport. The amount of engagement and use of that by folks doing their 10,000 steps and those kinds of initiatives really says to me that that's an ESG initiative. So I guess the point, Zoe, is whilst these things may not be badged as specifically ESG initiatives, they fundamentally are, and they are delivering ESG outcomes. I'd actually suggest, I grew up in the bush, and I'm pretty sure if I went out west and started prattling on about ESG, I'd get rolled eyes and told to get back in my box. But I think it's more about the professionals such as you guys framing those sorts of things in the language that the community is comfortable with. It doesn't have to be called ESG, but I can guarantee you, if you went to Longreach, they'd be pretty proud of that particular walk. And because of that, there may be some suggestion that council may want to extend it to other areas. In the back of our minds, we as professionals are going, oh, that's great. We've got a really good ESG outcome from that, particularly if you extend it to, engage with the community about where it might want to go next and all of those kinds of things. So that's just one that jumps immediately to mind. I'll talk a little bit about more specifically the emissions stuff that I've done out west in a little while. Also, by the way, that type of initiative is a climate change initiative as well. It's part of climate change adaptation to increase shade, increase greening in the community as well.
Okay, well, you kind of, that's ideal how you frame that too, because when we think about ESG, I know personally, I'm really mainly focusing on the E, on the environmental outcome. And in local government, like you said, it's core business for us, or it should be. But my immediate thought is jumping to those waste management outcomes and, the weeds and the natural resources and those sorts of things. So it's good for us to hear about a wider context and reframing the conversation. And you said in your presentation around how we have the opportunity to drive change in our community particularly through our procurement practices and help, embed those practices. And particularly since we would have a lot of, in local government, yes, we have tier 1 company suppliers. And, my region is, one of the biggest mining regions in Australia. So we've seen the social license from the mining companies. But it begins at home, and having the grader driver and our parks and rec teams, and everyone understanding how what they do contributes to ESG. I guess any tips on how we can reframe some of that language to bring it into those layman's terms to help educate internally, and then have ambassadors out in our community who are out there on the front lines engaging every day?
Yeah, look, one of the things I suppose I'd suggest, and you've mentioned waste a couple of times, forgive the pun, but trying to reduce waste as an ESG outcome in rural and rural Queensland is a waste of time. The reality is that the environmental footprint of waste in rural areas is so tiny that there's not a lot of return on investment as far as, messing around with it too much. The extent of the containers for change stuff is probably the extent to which you could go to with waste at this time in rural communities. One of the ones I suppose I'd suggest is something that rural communities can engage in, however, is fuel use and diesel use. So I would suspect that diesel and fuel use in country areas is very front of mind with cost of living pressures and increasing in fuel costs. The single greatest thing councils can do in the bush in terms of their carbon footprint is concerned and their environmental outcomes is reduce fuel use. Now, grader operators, truck operators, etc., are not pretty switched on, common sense kind of folk. If you were to say to them, help us identify ways that we can save fuel, they'll know what that is, whether that's how they do their grading runs, whether that's, not starting the truck up 15 minutes before you start work to warm it up. It's 5 minutes, all of those kinds of things. will reduce council's environmental footprint. And you have the added benefit, it's going to reduce cost as you go. Now, you take that and roll that out to your subcontractor base, which in a lot of councils is as big, if not larger, than the council in-house fleet. Then you're starting to drive a significant change. As I said, this doesn't have to be about, hey, we've got this fancy new environmental initiative, when again we're back to the eye rolls. It's in reality, it's about saying, look, the cost of the community of diesel is high. Is there ways that you've seen that we can improve that or reduce that? Another really simple example from a council that I've done some work in is now this is going to seem simple, but they upgraded from a standard slasher on their tractors to a Pegasus slasher. So they went from being able to slash 6 to 7 foot to being able to slash, I think it was 12 foot. The practical outcome is that they could do the job in half the time with half the fuel because they had to do half the runs with the slasher. Now, that was a fantastic outcome. It required a small investment from council when they upgraded the slasher. They paid that off within 12 months, and they delivered this ongoing financial return as far as diesel reduction from that fleet activity. And hey, guess what? They delivered an ESG outcome at the same time. So it's those kinds of things where good business decision making, ESG will be the outcome anyway.
Oh, I guess we just need to start, keep it in the front of our mind and actually ask ourselves the question each time we're making those decisions: is there an ESG outcome here? So yeah, I'll let you move on to part 2 of the webinar to talk to us about the carbon emissions profiling, this fun topic. And I'll be back to help facilitate the Q&As at the end. So again, everyone, just if you think of something that you want to ask throughout the presentation, just pop it in the live Q&A.
Thanks, Zoe. Now, emissions profiling isn't some big bad beast, and emissions profile should not exist in their own right just because some mad granny like me has said that it's a good thing to have one. An emissions profile is the start; it's not the end. So I'll run through how you do an emissions profile, and then start to look at how having one can assist you in that business decision making that Zoe and I were just talking about. So emissions profile, just pretty much a big accounting exercise. When I do emissions profiles, I spend most of my time in council's accounts payable area and in council's asset management area. And the reason for that is that that's the best place to find the data as far as council's emissions are concerned. The data that I'm looking for is predominantly what are you spending on electricity? What are you spending on diesel? What are your contractors spending on diesel and fuel? How many cars you bought? How many air conditioners you've got? And the small bit, which is waste, is how much waste you're sticking in the ground. So that's broadly the data set that forms understanding council's emissions. The next step in that process is that for every one of those things you bought, each of those has basically a number attached to it, which is your emissions that come from that particular source. So as an example, a litre of diesel has a multiplier that says 1 litre of diesel is equivalent to this many tonnes of carbon dioxide. Really simple process. A nupty greenie like me can do it with a spreadsheet, so it's not particularly complex. The geniuses that work out that there's that much CO2 in a litre of diesel, now they're clever folk, but once that work is done, it's largely a data capture and spreadsheeting exercise. the next stage of that, and look, there's a bit more to it than that, but that's the basis of it. You then look at that and complete an emissions profile, which basically says that that council as an organisation or your community is outputting this level of CO2 equivalent as far as the emissions are concerned. They're split up into 3 different categories of emissions. So tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 emissions. The ones are ones that you are directly producing. The twos are the ones that you're producing via, contracts that you have or by others, but you've procured them. And the third are a bit more complicated, but are embedded emissions in activities. So, as an example, if you buy a car, it's got embedded emissions in terms of the production of that car. So this is an example of some of the data that is produced through that process. So as I mentioned, we start with your activity data, whether that's electricity or diesel or a range of activities that you're purchasing. Office supplies is a small one generally in councils. We then apply an emissions factor for that type of activity, and that will determine your emissions. So as I mentioned, you have your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions as far as that's concerned. This is a real life example of a particular council and their emissions profile. It's a small council. As you can see in this council, which has been my experience with other rural councils, fuel, particularly your contractor fuel, and this largely links to main roads contracts and those kinds of things, is your primary source of emissions if you are in a rural area with a large road network. If you're in a Southeast Queensland council, as an example, your electricity will be quite a bit higher due to streetlight networks and all those kinds of things. Interestingly, I'll point out in here, construction is quite high. Largely, that's linked to road construction, so concrete in culvert pipes, concrete in all your road construction activities. Concrete has a fairly large emissions factor, so your concrete use tends to drive your emissions up as far as that's concerned. So as you can see there, in the big scheme of things, your top 4, and I'll roll asphalt and bitumen into this, is your top 4 tends to be your road construction, your electricity, and your waste, depending on the size of your local government area in terms of population. So all this has some financial impacts on council, and I think this is an important basis for emissions profiling. As I said, it should be the start, not the end. For every bit of energy that councils can save, it saves you money and has the secondary outcome is that it reduces your emissions. So this can be everything from, solar panels on the roof of your admin building to, I walked past one yesterday, a park shelter that's roof was solar panels, right through to, insulating your buildings, to any of those activities. If you can make energy use reductions part of your procurement process in this, you are well on your way. You can take that a step further, and some of you may have come across these where council enters into private purchasing agreements with renewable energy suppliers. Sunshine Coast is probably the exemplar of that, with the large solar farm that's been constructed up the Sunshine Coast. But just as an example, wherever possible, councils should consider private purchasing agreements if they have renewable energy providers in their area. It's also a way, coming full circle back to ESG, for those renewable energy providers to develop a social license in their communities by entering into those negotiations with council with the aim of minimising that energy cost for councils. So as an example, whilst not an area that I've specifically looked at in any great detail, the South Burnett has a vast array of new renewable energy projects coming into the area. Feedback that I've received is those renewable energy providers perhaps haven't done as well as they should on the social license front. That may be an example where council can look to private purchasing agreements with those energy providers to not only deliver a financial outcome for council, but also a reduction in emissions and start to resolve some of those societal issues that are occurring around some of these renewable energy hubs. Look, the reality is, moving on to insurance, that insurance costs in communities are going to continue to rise, largely driven by, and putting the science of climate change and global warming to one side, the experienced reality at the moment is there are more weather events that are driving insurance claims. Insurance companies are obviously looking to recoup the costs associated with that, so insurance costs will continue to rise. If councils can consider mitigation activities around some of that, cost-effective mitigation activities, it does deliver that societal outcome from that perspective, and you'll drive down your insurance costs. Eventually that will be the outcome. So understanding your emissions profile and understanding where your cost base is for activities environmentally linked is where you can drive financial outcomes. And the final one, and this fluctuates, as I said, fuel usage and diesel usage is, I would say, if you're west of the Great Dividing Range, is your single biggest emissions driver. So any activities around that certainly have opportunity, whether that's reduction in use, whether that's looking to lower emissions fuels, those kinds of things. It could be as simple as for you, if you've got an office-based fleet in and around townships, that you look to plug-in hybrids and that kind of stuff as an opportunity. By the way, you're all finance professionals. It's also plug-in hybrids are currently FBT exempt, so you'll save a little bit of money along the way if you're offering private use arrangements on your vehicles. So again, multiple outcomes. So I wouldn't suggest, if you're traveling 600 kilometres in a local government area on dirt roads in your four-wheel drive, that you necessarily race out and buy a Tesla. But there is examples of vehicles that are in and around townships that's their primary function, where your plug-in hybrids may be an opportunity. It's not about the feel-good stuff of councils rolling out plug-in hybrids. It's just about energy reduction and around diesel reduction, so and cost reduction around that. And you guys are far more versed on this than I am. It's relatively easy to build a business case to see if that makes sense for you. So there's some of the financial performance opportunities that exist. And then some of the longer term stuff, climate change will impact on council's assets. It'll impact on chronic deterioration around your activities. It will impact on your infrastructure long term. And that liability issue will continue to rise. So this rolls out in things like, as an example, more disaster management costs, more rebuild costs after more regular, more extreme weather events. These are all practical realities that, regardless of the cause of any change, are having an impact. So an emissions profile is the starting point to understand how councils can contribute, and then can lead through to, okay, well, now that this is on the agenda, what are some of the other things that can be looked at? So this is an example I've mentioned a couple of times. So just a bit of background on Etheridge Shire Council. So for those that don't know, Etheridge is up in the Gulf, around about sort of 5 hours west of Cairns. and has the unique situation of being one of the new renewable energy superpowers of Queensland. So I'd like to think of Etheridge as having the Goldilocks location as far as renewable energy is concerned. They have some of the best wind resources in Queensland as far as wind generation is concerned. They have the most sunny days of most places in Queensland from a solar perspective. And they also are looking midway through construction of pumped hydro from a disused gold mine up there. So Etheridge has a strong agenda as far as renewable energy is concerned. I've undertaken a emissions profile for Etheridge, and like others, they have the majority of their emissions are generated from fuel use. Between the emissions profile we did in 21-22 and in 22-23, council managed to reduce its emissions by around 774 tonnes in terms of its council operations. Where it derived that from, you can see largely from the data. It's come out of their road construction activities and looking at ways it can reduce construction costs as far as concrete is concerned. And in addition to that, a reduction in fuel usage as far as both its fleet and its contractors' fleet is concerned. So, 774 tonnes, I wouldn't like to run the numbers on that in my head, but that would be in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars saved as far as fuel is concerned and diesel is concerned. So that's a prime example. Etheridge are fantastic in that this is becoming core business for them, and they love the fact that they're able to compare this to other councils. So the CEO has mentioned, and the mayor's mentioned from time to time, that they have about the same emissions as Douglas Shire Council, and Douglas is full of greenies, so they're pretty happy with that. And they're also rightly making the comment for Etheridge, at least at a community scale, they are in effect an exporter of carbon reductions, because the carbon reduction from the renewable energy sector is offsetting, and then some, the carbon emissions from their very large agricultural sector. So that's just an example of how in a rural council that are doing some fantastic work around these types of activities, and are promoting off the back of it too. By the way, I think I've got an emissions hat from Etheridge Shire Council that they've done. Blacktown's another one. I'll zoom through these fairly quickly. They have gone to a private entity who's installed a solar array on one of their large footprint buildings. Their council is buying that power directly, delivering 190 grand savings for that, and which equates to about 800 tonnes of carbon savings. It can be as simple as that. As an emissions reduction and cost reduction activity, those kinds of private purchasing arrangements for energy are a very simple way to drive change in this area. Again, I mentioned the Sunshine Coast Solar Farm. So this is a big deal. So the short story is council partnered and is buying its entire electricity demand off a private provider of a solar farm for all of council's buildings. It's delivering net savings to council of over $22 million over 30 years. I haven't mentioned in there, but also is delivering significant emissions reductions by undertaking this. So again, I can only highlight diesel and energy as two key areas to really zero in on. So that brings me to the end of the formal part. I noticed a couple of questions have popped up. Zoe, do I just answer those while I'm going? Or?
Oh, I'll read it out for the audience there.
Yeah.
But before we get to the question, I just wanted to do a shout out. We've got our annual conference coming up in 53 days. So, if anyone who wants to actually talk to some representatives from Etheridge Shire Council, we actually have 2 delegates already registered for the conference. So if you want to go and actually pick their brains about how they are doing things practically from a finance point of view, come to the conference. So early bird registration closes next Tuesday. So that's my little plug. But we'll get on to the question because we're running out of time. It's been such an interesting topic. So we've got a question from our audience. Wondering if you can quickly elaborate on Australian standards for ESG and emissions profiling for councils. How do you think it is trending or tracking in the current policy and political context? So mandatory climate reporting, disclosures, that sort of thing. Knowing that we're potentially going to have a change of state government, very shortly. So that's an interesting question. I'll hand that one over to you.
Yeah, it is a really interesting question, and so the basis is that, as I mentioned, the larger public companies will have mandatory reporting requirements against the ESG international standard. Don't hold me to this. I think it kicks in for the next financial year. That starts, or it's December or something like that. So the reality is that that's the start of the process, the mandatory element of that, and it will focus on those that are the bigger ones as far as higher emitters and that sort of stuff is concerned. Like all things from a local government perspective, it will be a case of, I don't think at this stage it's foreseeable that there'll be a mandatory reporting requirement for local government anytime soon. It really is around those councils that see that there's a leadership opportunity in this. No different, I'd suspect, to if you've been around long enough, there was triple bottom line reporting, there was all the things. So it's really, and by the way, I'm been around long enough that can get a bit jaded and bitter and twisted around the fact that these things won't be mandatory. Therefore, it's a bit of a flash in the pan and a waste of time and all of that kind of stuff. So that's that element. I think the political element will come from the fact that is changing the narrative around this stuff, that ESG is not a burden. It's a decision-making framework that will deliver you better environmental outcomes, better social outcomes, better financial outcomes, and potentially better governance outcomes. And that's fundamentally, I think, what motivates people to get involved in local government at a political level, is to achieve those things. So, to be honest, I don't mind what you call it. You can call it tiddlywinks if you want, but if it delivers those outcomes, if it provides you with a framework to engage your politicians to deliver those outcomes, then it's a good thing. And next week, if we want to call it something else, then let's call it something else. But fundamentally, it's about having that conversation and changing that narrative to go, if you want good outcomes in this space, guess what? There's finally a standard you can measure this stuff by. It can provide a decision support framework for us. Therefore, politically, there's something in this for you. There's votes in it. You've got a more engaged community. You've got a better environment. You're saving some money and you're more transparent. So there's no harm in any of that for your politicians.
Yeah, you're right. It's not going away. And I'm like you. I've been around local government, not quite as long as you. No, 20 years now, 20 years. And, finance professionals, quite often we're waiting for the international accounting standards come in. Then there's the Australian accounting standards. We're waiting for it to be made mandatory. So, we're always waiting because we have to do it. This is something that isn't going away. So it's something that we need to help the rest of our organisation to engage with and understand and build into the fabric of our culture. so that at the point in time when it does become mandatory, you know, or voluntary, we want to start reporting on it, we understand it fully and it's already part of our core business. So we've also got a comment here as an FYI. So climate-related disclosures legislation has passed. Mandatory climate-relating financial disclosures for certain corporation entities are reality for financial years beginning from 2025. So the standards, it is around the corporations though. It's not mandatory for the public sector, but it's going to be whether or not there's the political will. And we all know that when the state government brings in reporting for state government entities, very, very soon it is pushed down to local government in some form. So hopefully we'll have more of an update at the conference from the Department of Local Government, or whatever they'll be called, because, you know, they might come up with a new longer acronym after the state elections. So we don't have any more questions, and we've actually gone over time. It's such an important topic. So I wanted to say thank you, Bryce, for the presentation. You know, it's helped me to embed some of those principles and stop just thinking about the E for environmental. I wanted to thank everyone in the audience for their attendance. And before you log off, here's just got a few messages from the LGFP committee. So a copy of the webinar recording will be available on our YouTube channel over the coming days. The presentation slides will be available to members through the members library on our website. As I mentioned a few times, our annual conference is only 53 days away, and early bird registrations close next Tuesday, the 1st of October. Oh, I better register. Register before then to save $200 on your registration, and also remember to book your accommodation early. There's a discount link on the website. If you're wanting some advice or have a question, remember to pop it in our LGFP members network. And if you're not an LGFP member and would like to join, just see the membership area of our website or email admin@lgfp.org.au. So I wanted to say thank you again, Bryce, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your holidays. Thank you to everyone out there in webinar land for attending, and I hope to see many of you in person at the conference in November.
Thanks, Zoe.